In a class that I was teaching recently, someone mentioned about the rabbis of the Talmud, and they commented, we really don't know much about them. We don't talk about them very much. And it's true, we reference them occasionally. But I thought to share some thoughts about one particular rabbi of the Talmud this evening. Now, the chances are you've heard many of the names of our rabbis before their words were recorded between the 3rd and the 5th century. But you've heard the names. They ring a bell. Rabbi Hillel, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the redactor of the Mishnah, Rav Nachman. We know most of them for their rulings. We know them for their insights. We know them for their teachings. And among the greatest, and whose name is probably the best known, is Rabbi Akiva. We could spend a long time studying Rabbi Akiva's teachings, and perhaps on another occasion we should. But tonight, it's not his teachings that I want to explore. Rather, it's his life. One of the things you quickly begin to realize, even when you just begin your studies of Talmud, is it's not only the teachings of our sages that is so extraordinary, and admittedly, at least for me, at times confusing and even confounding, but it's also their personas, the way they have lived their lives, which for me has been the source of my affection. And so it is with Rabbi Akiva. His is the tale of a man who comes from quite humble origins, who overcomes great challenges, and to achieve the greatness that he ultimately acquires. His life, I think, is inspiring. It certainly has been to me. My mother spoke to me of Rabbi Akiva ever since I was 5 or 6 years old, because she loved Rabbi Akiva, and she would often share his teachings with me. But I trust the more you learn of his life, it will be inspiring to you as well. And in our world, which so often finds role models in great basketball players or great football or great baseball players, great hockey players or famous actors, famous singers, we Jews have been given role models in a completely different arena. So I want to share with you 9 reasons why I think Rabbi Akiva can inspire us and be role models to us, to our children and our grandchildren. And I want to acknowledge Rabbi David Rosenfeld, who garnered these ideas and put them together, and I just added my own twist to many of them. So the first reason he inspires us, I think, and can be a role model, is that he began his studies as an adult. There's a midrash about the way Rabbi Akiva begins his studies. It says that he went with his young son to Cheder. He went with his young son to school, and there he sat among all the children learning the alphabet, learning the Hebrew alphabet. Some of you come from stronger Jewish backgrounds. Some of you may not yet know an aleph from a bet. But that's where Akiva began, as an adult. Which leads me to the second reason I think he's so inspiring and indeed can be a great role model. He comes from deeply humble origins. You know the term yichus, lineage, as it's perhaps translated to? The Talmud notes that he had no yichus. He had no Jewish lineage. In fact, he descended from people who converted to Judaism. And that undoubtedly influenced the way he looked at the world. He was the one who declared that the most important principle, the klal gadol b'Torah, the central teaching of the Torah, and the most important was love your neighbor as yourself. Akiva undoubtedly understood that all people are precious to God, the rich, the poor, the schooled, and the unschooled. The third reason I think he can be a great inspiration to us and a great role model is that he himself was open to inspiration. Not only was Akiva open to inspiration, he acted on his inspiration. There was a definite turning point in his life. He was 40 years old, and he's walking by a well, and there he finds a rock. And there's a hole carved into this rock. And so Akiva inquires, how did this hole get here? And he's told that it was shaped by the drop of constant water on that rock. And he concludes that if something as soft as water can penetrate something as hard as a rock, then the Torah, which is as hard as iron, could slowly and surely penetrate my heart. That was his turning point. And he quickly goes off to study Torah, an odyssey that never stops in his life. If you're fortunate, there will be times in your life when something or someone inspires you. And when it happens, it's a wonderful gift. And I'll bet you that if you reflected on your life, you'd remember those times. Maybe you heard a speech, or you met someone, or you heard a sermon, you saw something, and you're moved. For most of us, we're inspired for the moment, and then pretty soon we get back to our lives. It fades. What made Akiva unusual was that he didn't let it fade. He seized the moment, and he changed his life. Which leads me to the fourth reason I think he's inspirational and a great role model. He persevered. We know, for example, students that just seem to get it academically. They don't have to study quite as hard as some of the others. They're naturally gifted. Yet there's nothing to suggest that Akiva had any of those abilities. What we know of him is that he had to work very hard to become who he was. The gift that Rabbi Akiva had was persistence, something that should never be minimized in life. The fifth reason he's inspirational and a great role model is that he asked the tough questions. And part of this had to do with, I think, coming to Judaism as an adult. You know, it's great to educate our children. It's great to create beautiful Jewish memories. And when our children reach adulthood, those that had whatever Jewish education they had are almost invariably so grateful to their parents. Some years ago on high holidays, before I was here at Stephen Wise Temple, I asked the congregation, how many of you had some Jewish education as a child? Almost everybody raised their hand. Maybe they went to Hebrew school. Some had more of an education, some had less. I said, how many of you went, particularly to Hebrew school in those days, because your parents insisted that you go? Everybody raised their hand. Then I asked, how many of you enjoyed going? I'm afraid to say not a lot of kids who were forced to go raised their hands. And then I said, how many of you are grateful to your parents for the Jewish education you had? And just like Susan, everybody raised their hand. And then I asked, how many of you wish you had more? And everybody raised their hand. I've repeated that survey, as it were, and the results are almost always the same. We're grateful for the Jewish education we had. So educating our children will make them grateful to us. But because Rabbi Akiva came to Judaism as an adult, he challenged from a very adult perspective. Here's some of the questions that are attributed to Rabbi Akiva, and you'll see they deal with some of life's most powerful issues. He asked, how does God judge the world? He asked, if man has free will and God knows the future, that means God knows what I will do, so do I really have free will? To quote the Midrash on Akiva, it said he is the persistent student, leaving no question unexplored or unexplained. The sixth reason he's inspiring and a great role model, he never forgot where he came from. Ultimately, Rabbi Akiva becomes a spiritual leader of world Jewry. He is sought out by all people, all Jews who want their questions answered and to get his opinion. He becomes wealthy, and yet he never forgot where he came from. He knew the pain of poverty, of being unlearned, of being unknown. In fact, the Talmud records that Akiva remembered that at one time he actually resented the scholars of the Torah. And he never forgot that resentment felt by those who don't have means. And he had a love and a patience for them because he knew what it was like. The seventh reason I think he's inspiring and a role model, he lost everything and he came back. When he became well known, he was ultimately a teacher to some 24,000 students. And the Talmud records that one year between Passover and Shavuot, during that 49-day period, there was an epidemic, and all of his students died. The loss to the Jewish world was devastating. But imagine the loss to Rabbi Akiva. He had devoted his life to those students. He had spent his entire adult life shaping this next generation. And 7 weeks, they're all gone. Rabbi Akiva could have given up, or he might have even concluded that God was not interested in his work. But what does he do? He begins again. He finds new students, 5 of them. No longer does he try to garner thousands of students, but he focuses on these 5 students who help to restore Judaism. Rabbi Harold Kushner wrote in one of his books, "What do you do," he asks, "when your dreams are shattered?" And he responds, "You dream new dreams." You may remember just a few weeks ago when he and I were here, when he was here together, I asked him about that. That's what Rabbi Akiva did. His dream was shattered, but he dreamed a new dream. The 8th reason that he's a role model and successful, he knew this was all because of his wife, Rachel. Akiva was working as a shepherd, and he worked for a man named Kalba Savua. Kalba Savua was one of the wealthiest people in the world. And it was his daughter, Rachel, who saw in Akiva certain qualities. He was working as a shepherd, but she saw him as being modest and being refined. And she proposed to him with one caveat, that he would study Torah. She would only marry him if he would study Torah. And they get married in secret. And when her father finds out, he disowns her and takes away her money. He gives her nothing, and the Talmud records that Akiva and Rachel lived in poverty. But she believed in him, and she was willing to leave any wealth for him because she believed he had the ability to do great things. It was Rachel that encouraged Akiva to go away to study, and Akiva did just that for 12 years. For 12 years, they don't see one another, and during those years, Akiva becomes this great scholar. Finally, he returns home, and he's about to go into his home, and the legend is that he hears Rachel speaking to an elderly man who says, "How much longer are you going to live like this? You're living like a widow while your husband is away." And she says to him, "If it were up to me, he would go away for another 12 years. Well, Akiva overhears this and goes back for another 12 years. And when he finally does return after 24 years, he does so with 24,000 students. Imagine how Rachel must have felt. But Akiva knew that it was his wife who discovered him and encouraged him and enabled him to become the great scholar and teacher he was. And he never forgot it. And finally, he's inspirational and a hero because he died as a hero, proclaiming his love for God. Rabbi Akiva loved God so much that he was willing to teach Judaism, even though it was against Roman law. And when they found out, the Romans sentenced him to death by torture, and the Talmud describes how they flayed away at his flesh with hot combs. And in one of the Talmud's most famous incidents, it's written that in his final moments, Akiva is heard reciting the Shema. And his students ask him, "How can you praise God while you're being tortured?" And Akiva famously answers, "The Shema teaches us to love God with our soul, with all of our souls. I understood that to mean even if they are taking your soul. My entire life, I agonized over this verse. Would I really love God even if my soul were being taken? At last, I have the opportunity to demonstrate this. How could I not do so now? And the Talmud records that as he finishes the Shema, he dies with the words, "The Lord is one," on his lips. One of the great gifts of our tradition is that we have been given great teachings, great insights on how to lead our lives. And yet, as wonderful as these insights are, we're given perhaps an equally great gift. We are given people who led lives committed to such ideals. They may not have been great athletes. They may not have been in a rock band or know how to rap. They might not have been famous. But in a generation in which role models are all too often rarely selected for the right reasons, we were given great men and women to emulate 2,000 years ago. And so just as it was then, during the first century, that a young woman named Rachel discovered and fell in love with a shepherd named Akiva, tonight it is up to us to rediscover him and love him for ourselves. Shabbat Shalom.